and speak. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about my research today. It's a pleasure to be here to well, not only share my research, but also get your thoughts on it and hear how what I'm speaking about today is something that you might have experienced or seen someone in your community experience, and to have a really interesting discussion about how we can address some of these barriers. So I conducted this research as part of my PhD while I was at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So I should acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Brendan Larson from the University of Waterloo, as well as Dr. Daniel Birdsey from the University of Brighton, who also contributed to this work. So what inspired me to explore Muslim access to nature was I was in North London doing one of my projects in the Lee Valley Regional Park, which is one, as if you've been there, you'll see it's one of the most ethnically diverse places in London. And I just began to notice that certain parts of the Lee Valley were very white and not representative of the surrounding communities. And as someone who's really benefited from nature and having access to nature my whole life, I really wanted to understand why these more diverse community groups weren't using these spaces, what barriers were limiting them from doing so. Yeah, so I chose Muslim communities, and yeah, I had the privilege of speaking to many female Muslim leaders. So that's the research that I'll be speaking about today. So how does interacting with nature benefit our health? Most of you have probably seen either in the literature or in popular media something about this link between being in nature and our health. It was particularly evident during COVID, when going into nature was one of the only things that we could do. And the literature has shown that there's a really vast amount of benefits that we can get from interacting with nature. Mental benefits, physical and social benefits. And studies have shown that people can get these benefits not just from being in nature, but even from just seeing nature, smelling nature, hearing nature sounds. There's been some really interesting research even about how people can heal faster if their hospital room faces a natural environment instead of a cityscape. And there's a lot of really interesting research out there about the theoretical explanations for this relationship, which I don't have time to go into today, but I'd really encourage you to look into it because it's quite fascinating. And another really great thing about these health benefits is that studies have found that interacting with green space can have more pronounced outcomes for people in greater socioeconomic deprivation. So improving access to nature can actually reduce health inequalities. So there's a lot of potential for the benefits of really ensuring that all community groups have access to nature. But as I'm sure you're aware, and as Mohammed introduced at the beginning, there's a lot of groups that are underrepresented in natural spaces. And most of this research comes from Western countries, so from Europe and also from North America. And these groups include many minority ethnic communities, including Muslim communities, but also people with mobility constraints, those in economic deprivation, and in some cases, children and older people. And like Mohammed said, there's been quite a significant effort to improve the amount of green space in economically deprived areas. But unfortunately, this doesn't often result in improved use patterns among these underrepresented communities. So clearly, this indicates that access to green space is really about much more than geography. And so that's what really I was interested in with this study that I'm going to be speaking about in a few minutes here, is looking at those other benefits beyond geography. So for those of you that like to go into the countryside, this might represent the kind of typical user that you would see, you know, white, all the kit, all geared out. And this is the, and you know, that indicate that if you go into the countryside and you don't see anyone that looks like you, that's could present a barrier in itself. And it might get you to think, you know, why aren't other people using this space? What, and before you even go into the space, present this kind of these feelings of exclusion. And in 2019, Julian Glover conducted research for the government looking at areas of outstanding natural beauty, as well as national parks. And he wanted to understand why some of these groups are underrepresented. And this is just a quote from this report. So it is felt as if national parks are an exclusive, mainly white, mainly middle-class club with rules only members understand and much too little done to encourage first-time visitors. And this was only in 2019. So clearly there's still a lot of work to do to make these green spaces more inclusive. And one really, a figure that stuck out from that report for me was that of the almost 1,000 board members of areas of outstanding natural beauty, only 0.8% were from minority ethnic communities. And these are the people that are making the decisions. It's their kind of vision that's guiding the management, design, and marketing for these spaces. So if the people making these decisions don't reflect the communities that are using the space, then that's an immediate kind of barrier that can affect kind of all different aspects of protected area management. And some of you might have seen this example of the realities of what exclusion can look like for Muslim communities, or perhaps experience this exclusion yourself. This was a Muslim hiking group that was started a few years ago, and they were featured on Countryfile, I think just in the fall, and unfortunately experienced a lot of racist abuse on social media, including comments like this, like "leave this place alone for proper walkers." And this was just a few months ago. So it just highlights some of these significant exclusionary barriers that Muslim communities can sadly experience in nature. So now I'm going to speak a little bit about the specific study that I did. And I wanted to just start off by saying that there's been some criticism of the research on minority ethnic communities and access to nature, because what it often does is homogenizes minority ethnic communities into, say, an umbrella term of BAME. And then then you can't really understand what are the unique barriers and opportunities that we can use to help these many different groups have greater access to nature. And so I wanted to study a more specific subset of people who are excluded, often excluded from natural spaces. And I decided to choose Muslim communities, while also recognizing that there's also significant diversity within and among different Muslim communities. So that's also something that I wanted to capture to some extent in this research. And I think it's also really important for me to acknowledge my own privilege, in that many of the barriers that my participants expressed are things that I haven't experienced myself. I've always felt like I could quite easily access the natural environment. And I think, so just acknowledging that privilege, I think is important. And also, just as my position as a non-Muslim white researcher, I sought to be really reflective as I was conducting the interviews and as I was analyzing the results, to identify how my own worldview might affect the results, and tried to minimize bias as much as I possibly could. But of course, it's always it's impossible to separate myself completely from the research. But I tried to be as reflective as possible. So for this study, I conducted 14 in-depth hour-long interviews with predominantly female Muslim community leaders in the UK. And I wanted to explore what are the barriers to accessing green space, but also what are some opportunities that we can use to better promote these spaces. And to give some kind of context for participants, so they weren't just trying to think of ideas out of thin air, I used this case study of Walthamstow wetlands that I mentioned earlier. So it's in the Lee Valley Regional Park, so in North London, surrounded by a really a lot of ethnic diversity. But from being there myself, unfortunately, I noticed that well, it wasn't reflective. The users of this space were not reflective of the community. Whereas if I went to just a park space that was just a few minutes away, I noticed that the diversity of users was significantly higher. So this space is really close to a popular tube station, and it's also free. So it kind of, in this way, I can really get at what are those barriers beyond geography that are limiting people from accessing this space. So I had participants review the website, because that's kind of the people's first introduction to a space, as well as take a virtual tour of the space, because it was during COVID, and as much as I wanted to take them on an actual tour, I couldn't. So a virtual tour had to do. And so what did I find? Well, these are just a few of the quotes from my participants. And this was from their initial impressions of viewing the website, going through the website and the images on it. I don't think I would feel as a Muslim any sense of ownership or link with this particular area. It feels like it's just bird watching for older white people. It's not really giving me that community spirit. And so one of the primary themes that I identified, and I phrased these themes as questions that a Muslim person might ask themselves when deciding whether or not to visit the space. So do I see myself represented? One of the first things that participants noticed about the website, that there was a real lack of ethnic diversity in the photo, so they didn't see themselves at all. And there was also a lack of diversity of the types of activities that the website showed. It was mainly just beautiful landscapes and pictures of birds, but not really a lot of photos of people actually using the space to show how the diverse ways that people could interact with the space. So another question, this is another theme that emerged. Do I feel confident in my ability to plan and interact with the space? There was often insufficient information about the space on the website. You know, how long are the trails? Could someone who has mobility constraints use them? Are there costs? Is there parking? All this information. And there was often kind of assumptions about knowledge levels about this particular space. So terms like a bird hide, to someone who goes out into these kind of more wild spaces all the time, they might know what that is. But there was no explanation for what this might be, or and that cropped up in several instances. These type kind of assumptions about that people are used to using these spaces and know how to use them. Are my faith, culture, and the inequalities that I experience considered? One thing a lot of my participants expressed to me was that often when Muslim communities go out with their families, it's a really large group of people. It's more than, you know, a mom and dad and 2 kids. There's extended family and friends. And in this particular space, there was 2 picnic tables. So really it was completely inadequate. And there really wasn't a lot of diversity in terms of the activities that were advertised or that offered in this space. So the activities weren't necessarily appealing. There was also no indication of whether halal food options were offered. And participants expressed to me that even just even if the food is all halal, just having a notice saying so immediately makes them feel like my needs have been considered in this space. Participants mentioned that they a place that they could go to pray so that they could stay at the space for longer and didn't have to go home at certain times of day. And also the inequalities that people experience. So even if the space is free, how much is it for a coffee and sandwich at the cafe? If someone goes into this green space and they can't afford to buy a coffee, and everyone in the cafe looks different than them, that doesn't make for a very good start or beginning of someone's experience in this space. And then, do I feel secure in the space and safe to express my culture and religion? There might be there was a real lack of user diversity, as well as the diversity of the volunteers and staff. And also in some places, a lack of visibility. And, if there's lots of trees around, that might make someone feel quite vulnerable. So there was really lots of different barriers mentioned. And but there was also some opportunities that people brought up. And one of those was that participants mentioned there was quite a strong connection between nature and Islam, and in kind of two ways. The first being that participants described how experiencing nature is a way of connecting with God. And this is just one of the quotes that reflected this. So we want natural spaces to be our cathedrals, churches, our mosques, synagogues. We want that because that is already made for us by God. And participants mentioned how they're encouraged to undertake Eid congregational prayers outside. So this could really present an opportunity where community centers, community groups could go and use the space for something that is a normal part of their day, that they feel safe with, maybe with their friends and family, so they can go and use a new space doing an activity that they're very comfortable with people that they're comfortable with. So it's an immediate way that we could overcome some of those barriers that I mentioned before. And participants also mentioned that Islam portrays people as caretakers of the planet. So we're told in the Quran that we are stewards or guardians on the earth, and every one of us have been put in a position where we are responsible for something. So participants talked about how participating in activities like litter picking, tree planting, charity hikes, all of these things are really encouraged among Muslim communities and would really motivate people to get out there and into nature and be using these spaces. So both of these present kind of really unique opportunities for encouraging and making these Muslim people to use these spaces, and also making them more inclusive. So participants didn't indicate that it was kind of necessarily any one of these individual barriers that would make them feel like, or make them decide not to use the space. It was more kind of the cumulative nature of many of these barriers that can lead to kind of these deep perceptions of exclusion. And many of these barriers reflect this kind of wilderness ideology, which often underpins many aspects of the marketing, through, for example, only showing images of beautiful nature and countryside rather than people actually using the space. It's this wilderness ideology kind of presents nature as something that's out there, that we go for solitude and reflection, rather than as something that we want to be using and interacting with and have lots going on. So that underpins the marketing, design, and management of these spaces, partly because, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of decision makers reflect only a certain viewpoint. So I think the first kind of step in terms of making these spaces more inclusive is to ensure that, or improve the diversity of people making the decisions for these spaces. And yeah, so I think that's I'll stop talking now. Thanks again for having me and giving me this opportunity to present on my research. You can access the paper by using that QR code. And if you can't access it because you don't belong to a university or something, then just email me and I can send you a copy, or we can circulate a copy to everyone who is at this meeting. So yeah, thank you so much. Stop.